You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. The Federal Telemarketing Framework begins with the Telemarketing Sales Rule, or TSR, issued by the Federal Trade Commission. The purpose of the TSR is to prevent deceptive or abusive practices in outbound sales calls, protecting consumers from fraud, misrepresentation, and harassment. It applies broadly to sellers and telemarketers engaged in offering goods or services through interstate telephone calls. For learners, the TSR demonstrates how consumer protection law adapts to high-volume marketing environments. Unlike passive advertising, telemarketing intrudes directly into private spaces, which means stronger rules are required to safeguard privacy, prevent manipulation, and create accountability for business practices. A key feature of the TSR is the requirement for clear disclosures at the outset of a call. Telemarketers must immediately identify themselves, state the seller they represent, and disclose the nature of the call. Material terms, such as price, conditions of sale, refund policies, and restrictions must also be conveyed. For learners, these disclosure obligations illustrate how transparency is built into consumer interactions. By requiring clarity up front, the TSR helps prevent confusion and ensures consumers can make informed decisions rather than being pressured into commitments without understanding essential details. The TSR also explicitly prohibits misrepresentations. Sellers may not make false or misleading statements about cost, performance, refund policies, or material facts related to goods or services. This prohibition addresses the history of fraudulent telemarketing practices, where promises of prizes, financial benefits, or risk-free trials were used to manipulate consumers. For learners, these restrictions reinforce that honesty is not optional in marketing. Even exaggerations or omissions that materially mislead can constitute violations, demonstrating the rule's alignment with broader consumer protection standards against deceptive practices. One of the most significant aspects of the TSR is its connection to the National Do Not Call Registry. Sellers must scrub their call lists against this registry every 31 days and are prohibited from calling registered numbers unless an exception applies. For learners, this provision underscores the principle of consumer choice in telemarketing. The registry empowers individuals to opt out of unsolicited sales calls, making it a cornerstone of privacy protection in the telemarketing context. Institutions must invest in robust list management systems to avoid inadvertent violations, which can result in significant penalties. In addition to the National Registry, the TSR requires sellers to maintain internal do-not-call policies. When a consumer requests not to be contacted, the seller must honor that request regardless of whether the number appears on the national list. For learners, this reflects how personal autonomy operates on multiple levels. Consumers are not limited to blanket opt-outs. They can choose to stop communications with specific entities. Institutions must maintain detailed records and procedures to ensure these requests are consistently respected. Call abandonment restrictions also apply. The TSR addresses predictive dialer systems that dial multiple numbers simultaneously to maximize efficiency. Abandonment occurs when a consumer answers but no agent is available to speak. To limit frustration, the rule caps abandonment rates at no more than 3% of calls answered per campaign per 30-day period. For learners, this demonstrates how operational efficiency must be balanced with consumer dignity. Aggressive dialing cannot come at the expense of treating people respectfully. Caller identification rules further reinforce transparency. Telemarketers must transmit caller ID information, including the seller's name and telephone number, so consumers can see who is calling. For learners, this shows how even technical details of telephony systems support privacy. Concealing or spoofing identity undermines trust and impedes consumer control, while mandated caller ID empowers individuals to screen unwanted calls more effectively. Special disclosure requirements apply to offers involving negative option features, free-to-pay conversions and continuity programs. For instance, if a free trial will automatically convert into a paid subscription, the telemarketer must clearly disclose the terms and obtain express informed consent. For learners, this requirement addresses common points of consumer confusion. Automatic charges are not inherently illegal, but they must be explained with clarity and consent to avoid deceptive practices. The TSR also bans advance fees for certain goods and services. Telemarketers cannot charge upfront for credit repair services, debt relief, or recovery services for previous scams. This provision protects vulnerable consumers from being exploited by false promises. For learners, this highlights how regulators target known problem areas with categorical prohibitions. Advance fee bans prevent recurring abuses in sectors historically rife with fraud. Payment method restrictions add another layer of protection. The TSR prohibits telemarketers from accepting certain payment types, such as remotely created checks or unsigned debit authorizations that have been associated with high fraud risk. For learners, this reflects how consumer protection extends beyond words to financial mechanics. Limiting payment options reduces the likelihood of fraudulent schemes by eliminating methods that provide little accountability or recourse. Record-keeping obligations under the TSR require sellers to maintain detailed documentation. Scripts, consent records, disclosures, advertising materials, and call details must be preserved for set periods. For learners, this demonstrates how compliance is verified through evidence. Regulators rely on documentation to audit practices, and organizations must treat record-keeping as an essential part of governance rather than an administrative burden. Charitable solicitations receive special treatment under the TSR. While charities themselves are exempt, for-profit fundraisers calling on their behalf must comply with many TSR provisions, including disclosure and misrepresentation rules. For learners, this highlights how exemptions operate with nuance. Charitable missions are recognized, but consumers are still protected from abusive or deceptive practices by third-party fundraisers. Penalties for TSR violations are significant. The FTC may impose civil penalties, restitution, or injunctive relief, and private settlements often involve millions of dollars in redress. For learners, these remedies show how enforcement ensures compliance. The TSR is not an aspirational guideline but a binding set of obligations backed by financial and reputational consequences. Finally, the TSR operates alongside state telemarketing laws. Many states require telemarketer registration or impose stricter limits on calling practices. For learners, this interplay illustrates the layered nature of U.S. telemarketing regulation. Compliance programs must account for both federal and state rules, creating a complex but necessary framework to safeguard consumer rights in every jurisdiction. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. The Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA, complements the TSR by focusing specifically on the technology and methods used to contact consumers. Its scope covers calls and text messages made to residential lines, wireless numbers, and certain other categories of telephone services. For learners, the TCPA represents the convergence of privacy, technology, and consumer choice. It was enacted to address the proliferation of robocalls and intrusive marketing tactics, and it has become one of the most frequently litigated consumer protection laws in the United States. By governing both live telemarketing and automated outreach, the TCPA sets strict parameters on when and how organizations may use telecommunications to reach consumers. One of the core distinctions under the TCPA is between prior express consent and prior express written consent. Informational or non-marketing communications, such as appointment reminders or delivery notifications, may be permitted with a consumer's express consent, which can be given orally or electronically. In contrast, telemarketing calls or text messages made using an autodialer or prerecorded voice require prior express written consent, captured through a signed agreement that is clear and conspicuous. For learners, This distinction highlights the higher standard required for marketing activity. The more intrusive or commercial the purpose, the stronger the consent safeguard must be to protect consumer autonomy. Restrictions on auto-dialed and pre-recorded calls apply especially to wireless numbers and other sensitive lines, such as emergency services or hospital patient rooms. The TCPA prohibits using these technologies without proper consent, recognizing that such calls impose direct costs on consumers and disrupt critical services. For learners, this provision illustrates how privacy law adapts to economic realities. Wireless users bear charges for unwanted calls and texts, making consent not just a matter of dignity, but also of financial fairness. The TCPA explicitly treats text messages as calls, ensuring that protections apply consistently across voice and messaging channels. This alignment prevents loopholes where organizations might avoid consent rules by shifting from calls to texts. For learners, this demonstrates the adaptability of regulatory frameworks. As communication channels evolve, laws must evolve with them, applying enduring principles of consent and fairness to new mediums of outreach. Time-of-day restrictions under the TCPA prohibit telemarketing calls before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m. local time. This rule protects the sanctity of private life, recognizing that timing is as intrusive as frequency. For learners, this highlights how privacy is not only about whether outreach occurs, but also about when it occurs. Respect for personal schedules is embedded in the statute, reinforcing the principle of proportionality in consumer contact. Identification and opt-out mechanisms are required for pre-recorded messages. Telemarketers must identify themselves at the beginning of the message and provide an automated, interactive opt-out mechanism within the call. For learners, this ensures transparency and consumer control. Even when technology is used to scale outreach, individuals retain the right to know who is contacting them and to easily stop further communications. The TCPA also recognizes the concept of established business relationships, allowing some flexibility for organizations to contact customers with whom they have recent transactions. However, this exception has narrow applicability and does not override do-not-call rights or consent requirements for auto-dialed or pre-recorded calls. For learners, this reflects the balance between operational practicality and privacy. Relationships may justify certain outreach, but they do not provide carte blanche to ignore broader protections. Consent revocation rights are explicitly recognized. Consumers must be allowed to withdraw consent through reasonable means, and institutions must honor revocations promptly. Courts have repeatedly emphasized that consent is not permanent and may be revoked orally or in writing. For learners, this reinforces the principle of ongoing autonomy. Consent is a dynamic agreement, not a one-time transaction, and organizations must respect consumer control throughout the relationship. Vicarious liability principles extend TCPA obligations to sellers whose telemarketers or agents violate the statute. This prevents companies from evading accountability by outsourcing outreach to contractors. For learners, this underscores the theme of shared responsibility. Legal obligations follow the brand benefiting from outreach, ensuring that accountability cannot be shifted away from the consumer-facing entity. Certain exemptions exist, such as calls made for emergency purposes or specific healthcare messages that are time-sensitive and beneficial to consumers. These carve-outs recognize that not all unsolicited communications are harmful and that some may serve important public interests. For learners, exemptions demonstrate proportionality in lawmaking, where beneficial outreach is preserved while harmful practices are constrained. Enforcement under the TCPA is particularly notable for its private right of action. Consumers may sue violators in court with statutory damages of $500 per violation and treble damages of up to $1,500 for willful or knowing violations. For learners, this highlights how enforcement power is distributed not only to regulators but also to individuals. The availability of class actions amplifies this power, creating significant financial and reputational risk for non-compliance. Litigation trends under the TCPA have shaped industry practices significantly. Class actions targeting robocalls and text message campaigns have resulted in multi-million-dollar settlements, prompting organizations to invest heavily in compliance programs. For learners, this illustrates how legal risk drives operational behavior. Compliance is not only about avoiding regulatory enforcement but also about mitigating exposure to private litigation. Compliance programs under the TCPA require disciplined processes for capturing consent, scrubbing numbers against do-not-call lists, monitoring vendors, and documenting outreach activities. For learners, these elements reflect the operational reality of modern compliance. Laws like the TCPA are not satisfied through policy statements alone. They demand rigorous, systematic processes that align outreach with consumer rights at every stage. In conclusion, the TCPA builds on the TSR to create a comprehensive telemarketing governance framework. By mandating clear disclosures, strict consent standards, do-not-call compliance, and disciplined dialing practices, the federal rules protect consumers from unwanted intrusion while holding organizations accountable for responsible outreach. For learners, the enduring lesson is that consumer contact in financial and commercial settings is a privilege, not a right. Telemarketing programs succeed when they integrate compliance into every aspect of operations, treating consent, transparency, and respect as the foundation for communication. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.